buyer and the seller for that matter really misses out on someone honing in on the key things that they need out of the deal.
Hi, I'm Jessie Greer with White Oak Legacy Partners, and welcome to the Legacy Lounge, where we focus on building, growing, and protecting legacies through business valuation, forensic accounting, brokerage exit planning, and commercial real estate services. Today I'm joined by Jerry Carter, founding attorney of Sierra Crest Law. With decades of experience handling business transactions and litigating complex disputes, Jerry has seen it all. From successful sales to deals that end in disaster. We're going to dive into how business owners can avoid legal pitfalls when buying or selling a business, and how smart planning, not just paperwork, protects your legacy. Because every legacy deserves expert care. Jerry, welcome.
Hey there, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for being on today.
My pleasure.
This is going to be a fun interview because Jerry definitely has the expertise, like I said, going into business transactional work and litigation. But before we get started, Jerry, tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Great. You know, when you're moving along in business and you have some headwinds or some rocky legal terrain and some uncertainty, and you wish you had a trusted legal advisor that you could just bounce things off of and make sure you're right on course, that's what we do. We have a lot of experienced attorneys who can guide you through situations and forecast things that might be on the horizon and help you avoid them.
And is this the side of law that you always anticipated going into from the get-go?
The business law?
Yes.
For sure. For me, it was kind of a marriage of when I was growing up, my father and a couple of his buddies started their own software development business. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I was on the high school debate team, living my best life.
Yeah.
In the law library.
Yeah.
And this kind of put them both together, the business law. So
yeah,
I'm living my best life.
So when you think back about really getting into the litigation side or business law of the legal field, was it your father's company that helped propel that idea, that concept? In other words, was there something that happened that you're like, you know what, this is where I want to be?
Well, I had a lot of respect and appreciation for business owners.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah. So as we dive into this, let's just jump right into it. What do you see go wrong most often with purchase and sales of businesses?
How long of a list do you want?
Well, let's start with at least the top three. What do you see the most?
Okay, top three. I think one thing that goes wrong, and it's subtle to see how it infects it, but one thing that goes wrong is dual representation, where you have the same broker or same outfit representing the buyer and the seller, and it infects the whole process and you get a bad result.
It's fascinating that you bring that up, right? So let's talk about commercial real estate real quick. Sometimes you'll see dual agency, right? And even with business brokerage, you'll see dual agency. What I find more common than not on the business brokerage aspect is really buyers don't seem to be represented. Is it traditionally the listing agent that's representing the seller and buyers just don't have representation?
I think that there's a saying that we all grew up with, which is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Mm-hmm. And you don't really appreciate it, the wisdom of that saying, until you've lived through something.
Yeah. So it's fascinating when you think about the idea that dual agency is in effect, right? In other words, you have the business broker representing not only the seller, but the buyer. So what is amiss from the buyer's perspective by not having his own representation?
Well, I mean, as a practical matter, and there are a lot of good, honest, well-meaning business brokers out there.
Yeah.
As a practical matter, the business broker's interest is in closing the deal and earning the commission.
Correct.
And so they want everything to be very bland and neutral.
Okay.
Short-ish agreements that they can, in good faith, hold out and say, well, this is a balanced agreement.
Okay.
Tell the buyer and say, well, this is a balanced agreement.
And when you say balanced agreement, do you mean traditionally like a boilerplate agreement that they use with other transactions versus something specific to that unique transaction?
Well, they usually, as a practical matter, they are boilerplate.
Yeah.
Because that's the forms that they have.
Sure.
I would say that sometimes they're balanced, but the buyer the seller for that matter, really misses out on someone honing in on the key things that they need out of the deal.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit of a mismatch. It's not going to be tailored. It's going to be like, one of those suits you go buy at Men's Warehouse, and it hasn't actually been tailored to your needs.
Yeah.
And if you're the buyer whose main concern is getting paid, it's not going to have the strongest security and payment terms. And if you're the seller.
Yep.
If you're the buyer who wants the thing to function like it was represented to function afterwards,
Yeah.
it's not going to have the strongest language for what happens if it wasn't as represented.
That makes sense.
And you're just left with a muddle.
Yeah.
And really no one benefits from the muddle.
And when you look at this muddle of a purchase and agreement contract or purchase and sell contract, give us maybe one example within the contract itself where you find the most issues.
Where things go wrong, well, for sellers, like we talked about, it's the payment terms.
Okay.
The seller, if a lot of these are structured where the seller gets paid over time, and you need to have some personal guarantees, and you need to have a security interest, at least in the assets you sold. But even then, that security interest gives you kind of a Hobbesian choice of, do I want to take the business back?
Yeah.
After someone else has been holding the reins for a while. And so preferably security outside the assets that are being sold. That's the seller and the seller's needs. The buyer really needs leverage for if something goes wrong. They need to be precise about what state the business is in.
Okay.
They need to hold back part of the purchase price.
Okay.
And have the right to hold back that purchase price if an issue comes up. So for example, we had a company that bought 8 little companies basically, all at a package, and they had a holdback. They held back I think it was 20 or 30% of the purchase price for a year, and then 15 for the next year.
Okay.
And during that first year, the Nevada taxing authorities wrote an audit letter and basically said, we audited your sales tax and there's a deficiency. And so our client was able, because they had indemnity language, all the boring legal terms.
Yes, that are important.
and the holdback, all they did is write a letter to the seller saying, this is your responsibility.
Got it.
We'll hold the money back until you resolve it.
Okay.
And it took a while for the seller to resolve it. And
Yeah.
it took more than the 2 years. And we just said, we'll hold the money.
Sure.
We'll get it resolved.
Sure.
And guess what? It got resolved.
And the money that you held back wasn't used to resolve this liability, right? It was there as a protection for the buyer.
I think in that instance, I'm trying to remember. I think with that one, they quantified the amount with the taxing authorities and just held back that amount.
Makes sense.
They
Okay.
reduced the amount of the holdback, but the money wasn't released until they had gotten sign off from the taxing authorities. So I think that they used their own money to sign off, and then they got the holdback back.
That makes sense. It's interesting. We talk about why owners, right, either on the sell side or the buy side, don't bring in attorneys soon enough or at all for that matter, right? You mentioned earlier that from a business broker standpoint, the goal is to get to the finish line, okay? Although with the goal getting to the finish line, you should have the best interest of the seller and the buyer, right, in hand, depending on who you're representing. What are some of the, concerns from a business broker standpoint in coming to a transactional attorney like yourself, right? Number one, it's going to be, well, wait a minute. Are we going to all of a sudden start throwing in all these legalese to where the deal is going to fall apart? And that sounds like, from what you and I talked about, not what you do.
I cynical people will say that lawyers are deal killers.
Yes.
I think that that's a short-sighted approach.
Yeah.
If you have a lawyer who's a trusted legal advisor and you want to do the deal, the lawyer will give you a path.
Yeah.
And help you complete the deal and keep you safe. And they're going to bring the issues to the fore. If a deal dies, I think more deals die from lack of enthusiasm than anything.
Okay.
And I was just talking with one of my attorneys about this today. Is really the deals that get done are because somebody decided that their top priority in life is to get the deal done.
Yeah.
And they push on it, and when something comes to them, when the ball's in their court, they turn it around.
Yeah.
And that they're just moving it along, as opposed to a little bit of languishing.
Sure.
Those tend to like fizz out.
Well, they always say time kills deals.
Sure,
It really does.
and that's the reality of it. So, I would say, get a lawyer you trust, and a lawyer who's problem, solving oriented, solution oriented.
And I think that's a really good point that Jerry brings up, because I think it's very important to be overly communicative with your attorney, right? In other words, let him know what your risk tolerance is, right? Let him know really what your goals are with this purchase and sale, right? Because I think that sometimes with attorneys that feel like they need to, let's say, over legalize documents, is to not necessarily justify the role and the position, right? But at the same time, that's not what you need. You need an attorney that can obviously protect you, right? Have the proper language in place, but also understand that, you look to get this deal done, right? So in other words, you could have certain language that you put in there that you recommend, and either the seller or the buyer can say, you know what, I understand the risk. I'm okay with the risk. Let's not worry about that if that's going to be a deal killer. Do you hear that quite a bit?
Judgment calls get made.
Yeah.
There's one thing you get with a good attorney is situational awareness. For example, a seller doesn't need a 30-page agreement.
Yeah.
They just need to tidy up. They need a 3 or 4-page security agreement, 2-page promissory note.
Yeah.
They don't need a 30-page agreement. Sometimes the buyers get overzealous because they experience more uncertainty. They don't know what they're getting into. And so as a substitute for doing their due diligence, they'll sometimes present you with a 40-page agreement that kind of throws everything in there, but doesn't really dial in what they need.
It's a great point that you bring up, is substituting due diligence, right? And I'll say this, we've even been part of deals where we were not representing the buyer from a business brokerage standpoint, and a little self-promotion here, but we do business valuation work. So we actually had a buyer come in that wanted us to do a business valuation study for the company that he was purchasing. And he said, I know that we aren't represented as a broker, but I would like for you to come in and also run due diligence on not only the financials, but the non-financial aspects. So I think, to your point, it's extremely important as a buyer of a business that you hire the right team, the right attorney, right? The right business valuation expert, the right business broker that knows how to run the due diligence so you're not caught up on the unexpected.
Yeah, and I'm starting to become aware that lack of knowledge about what you're getting into isn't always just. There's a lot at play there.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't know what their options are in terms of what they can ask to see.
Okay.
Sometimes people don't realize that it really is cost effective to get that knowledge. To have a professional look at it with you for you.
Sure.
And sometimes people just don't want to see it. And that's
Really?
beyond my realm. I'm not a psychologist.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, there are reasons why people just don't want to know
Fascinating.
certain things. It's like there are business owners who don't look at their financial statements.
Yeah.
Or put up with lousy bookkeeping, so they don't have good financial statements, and they just don't want to know.
So, go ahead.
And I can prove it because I used to be one of those business owners.
And it's a great point that you bring you bring up, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
So, we also do forensic accounting, and I can tell you, there's been a few times where, unfortunately, where you see the type of theft and fraud comes with key people, and when you don't have the proper procedures and policies in place, unfortunately, people tend to think that they're entitled to something when they're really not. So sometimes, to Jerry's point, as you start digging into the financials, even the owner's like, oh no, is there something going on that I should even know about? And sometimes going through this process, even if it does kill the deal, it makes the owner realize that there's something that they need to take care of.
Sometimes it's even worse. The owner has this personal relationship with this trusted key employee.
Exactly.
And has suspicions, and might say to themselves, subconsciously at least,
Yes.
if I really look into this, what's it going to do to the relationship?
Exactly. Yes.
Just be brave. Be brave.
So I guess if you only have to remember one thing that we just talked about, what would it be?
Oh, good heavens. Well, You alluded to the question of when should you get the attorney involved.
Yes.
And really, I think every business owner, and I hear this all the time, every business owner really needs a trusted legal advisor in their life that they can bounce things off. We had a business sale close just today, and the seller's been talking with me about this for 3 years.
Yeah.
And getting ready and positioning, getting everything lined up. And it's been, a conversation here, a conversation there, lunch here, lunch there, just to keep them on the right track. And so it's never too early to have that person in your life.
Is there ever a moment, or is there ever a time when a business owner is looking to sell a business or a buyer is looking to buy that they shouldn't have legal representation?
That they should not have legal representation? Good heavens. I cannot think of that time. So one thing to say is, you as a business owner are really good at the thing you do. And you're really lousy at the things you don't do. And I know that from personal experience because I'm good at the things I do. And I'm a horrible bookkeeper.
Yeah.
I'm a horrible accountant. I mean, that's why I hired these people.
Absolutely.
So I stay in my lane. But I would even say, even if you're an attorney and you're selling your business, you need legal representation.
I agree.
Because as they say, the person who represents himself or herself as a fool for a client.
That's true. So as we continue down this conversation, let's look at maybe some of the more detailed aspects of a business transaction. Let's talk about buy-sell agreements, why that matters, and how do we make them enforceable?
Buy-sell agreements, how it matters, and how do we make them enforceable? It matters to have your deal understood on paper. And this is actually something that comes up more often when people form a business together. They're getting along great. It's my brother-in-law or my friend. We have this plan, and they have all these understandings in their head, some of which are communicated in text and some of which are in email, and some of which are just handshake and in their head.
Yeah.
And what they don't expect or anticipate is that they'll forget.
Yeah.
And each person's version will change. And then, after money has been invested or after you start making money, a dispute comes up and you can't reconstruct the deal. You can't put it together.
No.
So you put the deal together while everybody's getting along.
Uh-huh.
And while you're poor, you haven't made any money yet and you haven't invested money.
Yeah.
So then bringing that to the buy-sell agreement, I think that most people that buy businesses know they need an agreement. They and what happens there is that they just do it kind of a half-assed way. Someone might go download something from the internet that may or may not apply, or someone comes in with a one-pager that may or may not be good, or something homemade is more likely to happen.
Yes.
And then you're in this muddle. And then you get to go hire someone like me, and we'll go to court for you. And the judge will say, yeah, well, homemade agreements are enforceable.
Yeah.
If I can figure out what it means, I'm going to enforce this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, because when you look at the structure of even the entity, right? And when you look at the bylaws, when you look at the operating agreement, when you look at the language within it, and one of them, right, being the buy-sell, right?
You were talking about buy-sell agreements ahead of time, like shareholder agreements. And things.
Yes,
Okay.
but
So the first part of my answer does apply.
it does.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And here's the reason why I'm bringing it up from this aspect, right? So we've gone through the deal. Let's say we've executed, we've closed the deal. We're going through now. We have a business where we have multiple partners, right? And what I've seen from not only the biggest business brokerage aspect, but also the business valuation aspect is we read a lot of operating agreements and bylaws. And what we tend to see is very boilerplate. Not to say that every single document needs to be, individually crafted for that business, right? But at the same time, where we find a lot of disputes is with business owners, to your point, right? They're 5 years down the road. Let's say one partner wants to get out, one wants to stay in, one wants to sell, one doesn't, right? And that creates the conflict. And what we find is that The buy-sell is just so weak in its language. In other words, it doesn't talk about how the business needs to be valued. It doesn't talk about if there's conflict getting, let's say, more than one valuation, right? In other words, it doesn't detail what it means for one partner to exit or sell.
Yeah, it's actually one of the funner things I do as an attorney. Help clients put together that agreement at the outset to how they're going to handle certain situations. What if one of you gets divorced? What if one of you passes away? What if one of you just gets tired of the business?
Yes.
And then how are you going to resolve disputes? And it's just usually you as the business owners, if you're asked the question, you'll know what you want to do.
Exactly.
We had one business started by 4 brothers, and we asked that question: how do you want to resolve disputes? And they said, we want to play rock, paper, scissors. Like if we have a deadlock on some issue, 2 against 2 or whatever, we're going to rock, paper, scissors it.
And is this on video for?
And so we wrote the instructions into the agreement. How are you going to rock, paper, scissors?
Yeah.
Nevada's kind of a fun place for that, because you'll see some agreements where, and maybe you've seen them, where they'll draw from a deck of cards, and whoever's got the highest.
I have not seen something that informal. This is fascinating. I love that.
But that is, it's not a totally irrational thing.
Okay.
It's like if you as the 4 brothers, truly deadlock, then you probably need some random thing.
Leave it up to chance
to do it.
Right.
Other times they'll say, well, we'll take it to a professional who knows something about that area, and we'll agree to be bound by their decision. But it's just kind of a fun thing. And if you think about it, doing your agreements is kind of like making a Christmas list. It's like, this is what I want in my life.
Yeah.
And I finally figured that out as a business owner, because I was drafting job descriptions. I thought, what a pain in the ass that is to draft job descriptions.
Yeah.
Until I saw it as like, what do I want this person to do for me? So I want to do it myself. And what do I want to take off my plate? Then all of a sudden, that's fun.
Yes.
Like, yes, this is what I would like. This, I would like that, and like the other. And it's the same way with the agreements. This is how I want it to be.
So it's interesting. Let's talk about in this scenario where you had 4 brothers, right? Hypothetically, assuming everything's equal, each one of the brothers owns a 25% stake in the business.
Which was the case.
Okay. Now, let's say one of the brothers wants to exit outside of, let's say, using rock, paper, scissors, or whatever it was. How informed are your clients about the idea of using business valuation, and then also lack of marketability and lack of control if they were to try to sell that interest?
Yeah, the more they know, the better. Basically, there are 2 ways you can go on an exit. And sometimes agreements do both ways. One is quote unquote book value, which is basically what's your account balance, divided by 4 or whatever.
Yep.
Which is going to be low, because it's not going to include the going concern, goodwill, and the other is fair market value. And fair market value is what a willing buyer would pay, what a willing seller would accept. And what you're getting to, Jesse, is that when you calculate fair market value, there are some subtle but very impactful considerations.
Impactful. Yes.
If I own 49% of a company and you own 51%, dollar for dollar, my shares aren't as valuable as your shares, because you have a majority interest. And if I own shares in a company that doesn't have a ready market, it's hard to liquidate, then that discounts the value of those shares.
Correct. And the majority of privately held organizations do not have a freely traded market for those interests, right? So it's extremely important to understand that if you own a 25% interest, and we'll just use easy math right now. The business is valued, you went through a valuation expert, it's valued at $1 million. Your interest is valued at $250,000, or so you think. But the reality is this, is that because it is a minority interest, you have what we call lack of marketability and lack of control. So what that means is that if you were to sell, or I were to sell my 25% interest to Jerry, he doesn't have control of distributions per se. He doesn't have control of being able to change management, be able to change, or let's say sell the company, right? So you're sitting there with a 25% interest where you don't even know if you're going to get distributions, because you don't have control of that, right? So now what we need to do is we need to say, okay, that $250,000 value really isn't worth $250,000 to a third-party individual. In fact, it might be discounted anywhere between, let's say, 35 to 45%, because the reality is no one's going to buy that value or that interest at that face value. And that's something that we do as business valuation experts, and we always try to educate our clients on every single time, especially if they're coming in with a minority interest like you're talking about.
Yeah. You're touching on the distinction between, or the difference between valuing the company versus valuing individual shares in the company.
And they both go hand in hand.
And if you explain that difference to some business owners, they'll, say the four brothers, they might say, well, look, we'll agree to parse it out 25, 25, 25. But you explain it to another set of four brothers, they're going to say, "Yeah, I see what you're saying," and
right.
we're going to go one layer deeper in the analysis.
Correct.
Of the share value.
Yeah, which I think is extremely important as well, because that's where I would anticipate litigation coming in upon the disposition or potential sale of those ownership interests. Is that fair?
Litigation or arbitration.
Okay.
It can happen in a lot of ways. I mean, the partners can have a falling out, or a partner can have a divorce, and a spouse acquires an interest.
Yeah.
An ex-spouse.
Yes.
Acquires an interest. Make sure you got language in your agreement about ex-spouses, please.
Oh, no
Yeah,
kidding.
yeah.
Right? Oh, fascinating. So when you look at, let's talk about other just examples. Let's say contingencies, right? When you're going through the acquisition process, what type of contingencies would you want to have?
So when you're talking about a contingency, I mean, a lot of people understand contingencies in the context of buying and selling a home. So you might have experienced selling your home, and the buyer comes in with an offer and says it's contingent upon me selling my home first, or even more likely, it's contingent upon me, getting a mortgage at such and such rate, and I'll lock it in within 15 days. That's a contingency.
Correct.
In the business world, conditions to sell, and the biggest one is usually that the buyer is going to have some period of time, 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, depending on the urgency, in which to examine the books and records of the company, go examine the factory or the physical facilities, get a report. Or if the business has land interest, maybe do environmental assessments. It could be quite a number of things.
Correct.
And they have an opportunity to do the due diligence. And so the condition is that it's got to meet their satisfaction before the deal goes hard.
So before the deal goes hard, if you're representing the seller, you're going to want to make sure that the buyer has sufficient funds or financing to be able to consummate this deal, right? When you look at, let's say, a deposit, an initial deposit, do you go off of a percentage of proposed purchase price, or how do you determine what a earnest money deposit should be that is refundable until the due diligence goes hard?
Honestly, we write it up however the parties agree to fund the deal.
What do you see as most common?
Usually a pretty limited initial deposit, just the earnest money.
1 to 3%?
Deposit, somewhere in there. Sure.
Okay, yeah.
And then they'll specify how much they're borrowing, how much is going to be paid over time, and how much will be cash on the barrelhead. And obviously, as a seller, you're going for more cash on the barrelhead.
Yeah.
As a buyer, you're going for more flexibility.
Exactly. When you find the contingencies, like you mentioned in real estate, do you find that financing is often a contingency of the purchase itself? In other words, the ability to get financing, SBA or otherwise.
Yeah, you're leading the witness here. Really hard. I mean, spoiler alert.
Right?
If you're going to get a loan, you're going to get an appraisal. And if you're going to get an appraisal, you got to talk to someone like Jessie. And the lenders, particularly the SBA lenders, are pretty sophisticated. They know how to read an appraisal. They want a real deal appraisal.
Yeah. Fantastic. So as we continue down this path, we've explored and talked about quite a few different things. And I think this is very beneficial for a lot of the business owners out there. let's think about one thing every business owner should do before entering a deal.
I want to ask you a question.
Please do.
Jesse. We have a lot of people who are interested in buying a business or selling a business, and it's sometimes difficult to talk them into just paying the money to get an appraisal.
Yeah.
What do you see around that in terms of why people put up resistance or they're reluctant to take that step of investing in an appraisal of the business?
I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of discussion about multipliers, right? My business is worth a multiplier of 4 of revenue or whatever it might be. That's even very predominant in the business brokerage community. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think, first of all, there's this perception of really understanding how to value a business, right? Mm-hmm. And like you said, just because you're a business owner and you know how to run your business doesn't necessarily equate to knowing how to value a business. Mm-hmm. But the perception is that you have this understanding and you would rather save on money to confirm that, right? Mm-hmm. Then have a third-party appraisal or someone like myself that can come in and really have an unbiased appraisal in point of view, right? So I think it's very typical, not only in business brokerage, but oftentimes in real estate where people just try to save as much as they can because they're making a large investment, when the reality is that they should be spending more up front to be able to understand if that investment is worth it or not with the risk tolerance that they have in place.
Yeah. I think sometimes people don't have the patience. They don't think that they're moving so fast. They don't know if it'll, be worth spending the time.
So here's what I like to do. When we are representing the seller, right, mm-hmm. of a business, first and foremost, we have what's called exit planning, right? So we are certified exit planning associates, and what that means is that we try to get business owners 3 to 5 years out from selling their business. And here's the reason why. We start with a baseline valuation. So you're going to come to us, right? And we're going to get a valuation of your company. Now, you might not like, or you may like what we have, right, for evaluation. But the reality is it's third party, it's unbiased, and it kind of gives you a perspective, right, of what buyers are going to be looking for. Now, if the spread is too big between what your perception is versus what reality is, then we take actionable steps to get you to where that value could eventually be based upon a myriad of different strategies that we have to implement to get you to that valuation down the road. So with that being said, we always like getting business owners in early, right? Because that sets the stage on having a true understanding of what the value of your business is. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then from that point, once it becomes necessary or time, or let's say the business owner is ready with the sale, then we're able to assist with actually selling the business as well, because we are business brokers too. So we are one of those rare firms out there, another self-plug, so I appreciate the question, is we're one of the rare firms out there that actually is a certified valuation analyst firm, so we can have a valuation study provided to you that is defendable even against the IRS, right? We do estate planning valuations as well, mm-hmm. right? So when you're working with us, you're not working with let's say a business brokerage firm that goes off of market multipliers or only looks at, let's say, 12 months of trailing numbers, right? In other words, we are very in depth, and that valuation, I think, is invaluable. Now, to your point, if we come across a buyer that is hurriedly trying to, consummate a purchase, well, it's all risk versus return, right? We will often say, hey, if we can take a step back, let's get all the information I need, let's value the business, let's get that third-party valuation, and then if you want us to help with the strategy for business brokerage as well, we can get additional due diligence documents, and then from there make a more educated approach towards the business acquisition.
Yeah, I kind of feel like, it might be speculation, I kind of feel like if both sides are in ignorance about the true valuation, and we're talking about multipliers and things, I think that tends to hurt the buyer more. I think the buyers overpay.
Well, it depends.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
I would be interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, it really does depend because let's say I'll give an example, right? Whenever we look at performing a business valuation study, we always try to look at a life cycle of a business or a minimum of 5 years worth of tax returns, right? It can work in both ways. And we're dealing with a company right now that's a great example. So 2024 revenue increased by 49% from 2023 and 2022 revenue, right? If you were to only do a trailing 12 month, you would have a valuation on a higher revenue than you normally would versus looking at all 5 years, right?
And higher acceleration too.
Correct. Right? Now you can be on the reverse side of that where maybe the last year wasn't the greatest, right? But the previous 4 years were, right? So when we assign value to each one of the years, those are the different things that we look at, right? So it can happen on both sides of the spectrum, really, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I want to go back to your original point, which is, and I don't know that everybody fully appreciates that. You're taking the temperature of your business, 3 to 5 years before you sell it, really does mean there are like actionable things you can do that increase the appraisal value of the business.
Yeah.
There's just like stock things that can be done, and you definitely want to take advantage of that opportunity. It starts with knowing where you are.
It's so true. And what's fascinating, I think a lot of business owners don't realize, it's not just financial, but it's non-financial as well. And let me give you some examples. So we came across a company that had top line revenue, let's say of around 30 million, right? Okay. As we start diving into this, what do we realize? Well, we realize that revenue comes from 3 streams of contracts, right? 3 contracts, okay? Now, we asked to look at the contracts and there were none. This is all handshake deals with the existing owner and his clients. Right? So if you're going to go in and you're going to value this company, you're going to see really client concentration to the point to where you're going to heavily discount those cash flows, right? So it's not only I would say economic, but non-economic. And let me give another example. So we often find, as it is with small business owners, where you're wearing multiple hats, right? You talked about a great example, like I'm not good at accounting, nor do I want to deal with accounting. Right? I hire people for that. So what we often try to do is strengthen the executive structure, right? In other words, a CEO shouldn't also be a CFO. They shouldn't also be the head salesperson, right? You should really build out your teams because here's the point. When you have someone that comes in to acquire your company, it's either going to be strategic or it's not. And either one of those versions, they're going to want to step into a company that can run without you. That holds more value.
Yeah, they see themselves as passive investors. They're not buying a job.
Exactly. And I think, it's really funny that you mentioned that, Jerry, buying a job. This is one of the conversations that we have to have with business owners, which isn't fun. But when you look at valuing the companies, a lot of time, because either you're looking at net asset value, right? Or you're looking at the excess cash flow, which creates the income stream, right? For the capitalization approach. And unfortunately, a lot of business owners are just buying themselves a job.
Yeah. So many things you can do.
For sure.
And even in the example you gave with the 3 contracts, there's a diversity. I mean, there's a concentration issue. There's also a question of, can the new owner step in and maintain the contracts?
Exactly.
And for that, you're going to need a written agreement that talks about what happens if there's a change of control of the company. Or fixes a long term. That's why when people go to sell their commercial real estate, they like to get long-term tenants in there.
Correct.
And, lock them into long-term leases and then go to market with the sale. And it's the same way for a business. You need to have some long-term contracts.
Yeah, that's a great point.
The bigger point is you can do stuff about this. Like if you identify the issues and you've got 3 years to work on it, you can really economically, strategically, you can address that and really boost the value of the company.
For sure. And that's one of the things that we discuss with our clients as well. So it's a great point, for sure. When you look at clients coming to you, tell me what you wish every client knew before calling you.
What do I wish every client knew before calling me? I wish that they knew the difference between working with a professional on what I call a transactional basis versus working with a professional on a counselor collaborative basis.
Okay.
And it's sort of the difference between just going, calling the attorney and saying, I need you to write this agreement, and then we'll both forget about each other.
Yeah.
Versus, I want you to get to know my business. I want you to get my goals, my plans, my future, and be proactive in helping me see how I can build this thing.
Yeah.
And it's just a different relationship. And I had a conversation with a client just yesterday. They had that kind of attorney, a really collaborative counselor, and guided them through a lot of difficult things. That person retired, and they got a new attorney, and the new attorney just kind of phones it in. And it's like a compliance manual book or whatever.
Yeah.
Something you can get off of AI. They'll send them something every once in a while, but it's very transactional. It's just piece by piece by piece.
Mm-hmm.
And the person I talked to says, I missed that.
Yeah.
I missed having the trusted legal advisor.
Yeah, and I think that's a great word right there, trusted advisor, or two words anyway. Mm-hmm. And really, when you look at it, any professional industry has its transactional individuals and trusted advisors. And I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoy the conversations with you, Jerry, is because you see it from a advisor standpoint. Right? In other words, it's not just consummating the transaction and moving on. It's helping the client understand the nuances behind it. And not only that, but creating that relationship where in the future, if they decide to expand or sell, they know they're going back to you. Yeah. What do you think? Any final words?
I just want to shout out the professional business appraisers of the world. Some people don't realize that they go through pretty extensive certification, qualification requirements to get to that state where they can render a solid business appraisal. And so not realizing that other people settle for less than they really should be settling for.
Yeah.
And so talk to your professional business appraiser.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me on the Legacy Lounge. Whether you're building, transitioning, or protecting your business or real estate wealth, we are your strategic partner for the future. I'm Jessie Greer, and remember, every legacy deserves expert care. Thank you.
Take care.